Hatred is easy in the daylight at a safe distance. But what happens when the curfew falls, the doors seal, and the one person you swore to despise is the only warmth left in the dark? Let us begin right now. The bell caught her mid-sentence. Hermione Granger had learned in 2 years of ministry service to measure time by the quality of the silence around her. The records vault beneath the Aura office kept its own weather. A dry, mineral hush, the smell of old parchment and colder iron, the faint blue whisper of preservation charms breathing over 10,000 shelved cases. She had stopped hearing it long ago. What she heard now, rising up through the floor and the walls and the marrow of the old stone, was the first stroke of the curfew bell. She froze with the file half lifted from its slot. 1. The sound did not ring so much as press, a low bronze weight that settled on the chest. 2. Somewhere far above, in the atrium, the great enchanted doors would be sealing themselves, seam by seam, the way a wound closes. 3. She counted without meaning to. Everyone counted now. 4, 5, 6, and on the 7th stroke the wards would lock, and the world would divide itself cleanly into those safely inside and those who had gambled and lost. 7. The lamp above her guttered once as the vault sealed. Then the quiet came back, but changed, thicker now with a texture to it, the particular airless stillness of a room that would not open again until dawn. "Well," said a voice behind her, dry as the parchment. "Isn't this a triumph of scheduling?" She turned. Draco Malfoy stood between 2 shelves at the far end of the aisle, one shoulder against the iron frame, his coat already off and folded over his arm as though he had known, some cruel minute before she had, exactly how the evening would end. The single working lamp threw half his face into relief and drowned the other half in shadow. Pale hair, pale mouth, the fine bones she had spent 3 years training herself not to look at. He was watching her with an expression she had come to know too well across a shared desk, the flat, appraising stillness of a man deciding how much of his contempt to spend. "You knew," she said. "I suspected." He pushed off the shelf. "You were the one who insisted we cross-reference the pre-wet file tonight. I merely had the good manners to let you finish." The unfairness of it lit something behind her sternum, quick and hot. "You could have said the bell was close." "I could have. I find I derive a great deal of private entertainment from watching you refuse to notice the time." He set his coat down on the reading table with a deliberate care that was somehow worse than carelessness. "You do it in meetings too. You'll argue a point to death long past the moment everyone else has surrendered. It's a kind of stamina. I've always admired it, in the way one admires a flood." Her fingers tightened on the file until the edge of it bit her palm. She was aware, distantly, of the effort it took not to let that pressure show in her voice. "We're locked in." "We are locked in." He said it lightly, but she saw the muscle move at the corner of his jaw, saw the tendon rise briefly along the back of the hand that came to rest on the table. He was no more pleased than she was. He was simply better at wearing the displeasure like a coat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The lamp hummed. Above them, unreachable, the whole vast machine of the ministry was emptying itself of the last few permitted souls, and out in the streets the patrols would already be moving. The slow, deliberate silhouettes she had watched from her window 100 nights, wands lit low, walking the emptied roads of a city that had learned to be afraid of its own dark. To be caught out there was to become a name in a report she herself might one day read. She had signed the recommendations for the emergency statute. She had believed in it, the way you believe in a splint on a broken thing, not because it is kind, but because without it the bone knits crooked. And now the law she had helped to build had shut its jaws on her in a windowless room with the one person in Britain she least wished to spend a night beside. "There's a cot in the warden's alcove," Malfoy said, as if reading the ledger of her thoughts. "One, I'll leave you to it. I have no intention of sleeping." "Neither do I." It came out too fast. Something flickered over his face. Not a smile, nothing so generous, but its distant cousin. "No," he agreed. "I don't imagine you'd give me the satisfaction of your unconsciousness. You'd sooner stand upright until dawn out of sheer principle. I'd sooner not be watched while I'm defenseless, if it's all the same to you." The words left her before she had weighed them, and she watched them land. His expression did not crack. It closed, a shutter drawn, quiet and complete. He turned away and busied himself with the pre-wet file she had abandoned, sliding it from her slack fingers with 2 spare movements, not touching her, careful not to touch her. "You needn't worry about your virtue in the vault, Granger," he said to the shelf. "Whatever you think of me, I've never been in the habit of preying on the exhausted." There it was, the thing that always lay under the sparring, the war between them worn smooth by repetition, but never blunted. She could have let it pass. She was tired. The sensible part of her, the part that had drafted memoranda and testified before the Wizengamot and kept her voice level through worse than this, counselled silence. But there was another part, older and less governable, that had been carrying something for 3 years and had just been handed a locked room and a whole night to set it down. "I don't think you're a predator," she said. "I think you're a coward. There's a difference, and it isn't in your favour." His hands went still on the file. The lamp's hum seemed to swell to fill the space where his answer should have been. She saw the white bloom of tension travel across his knuckles, saw him master it. 1 breath, 2, before he lifted his head. When he looked at her, his eyes had gone the colour of the vault iron, all the light pressed out of them. "Say what you mean," he said, very quietly. "You've been circling it for 3 years. We have until dawn. By all means, be thorough." Her heart was going hard now, high in her throat. She had not planned this. She never planned the things that mattered. They simply arrived, and she was left holding them. "I mean," she said, "that when it counted, when it truly counted, and there was a wand in your hand and a choice in front of you, you looked at the floor, every time. I was there, Malfoy. I remember which way you looked." The silence that followed had weight. It was not the empty silence of the vault, but a live thing, strung tight between them, a fine wire pulled to the edge of song. She had struck for the oldest wound, and she knew it, and some cold, satisfied thing in her was glad, and some other thing, quieter and ashamed, was already regretting it. He did not shout. She had braced for shouting. That, at least, she knew how to answer. Instead, he set the file down with terrible gentleness, squared its edges, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its polished cruelty and gone somewhere flatter and more dangerous. "Yes," he said. "I looked at the floor." She had not expected agreement. It knocked the next words out of her hands. "Is that what you wanted?" He came a step closer, and the lamplight found the whole of his face at last. Not the smirking mask she carried in her memory, but something worn thin beneath it, sleepless, stripped. The confession. "You may have it. I looked at the floor. I looked at the floor in a great many rooms. Granger. And I have spent every night since walking through them again in the dark. And I do not require your assistance to itemize the ways in which I failed to be a better man than I was. I keep that ledger myself. It is very complete." She opened her mouth. Nothing came. "So," he said, "now you have it. The great cowardice admitted. Do you feel it? That lift, that little clean rush of being right? Hold on to it. It's the warmest thing you'll find in here tonight." He turned from her then and crossed to the far end of the aisle and lowered himself onto the floor with his back against the iron shelving, one knee drawn up, his coat left folded on the table between them like a border neither would cross. He did not look at her again. Hermione stood very still in the ringing aftermath of having won an argument she had not meant to start. She had wanted him to deny it. That was the thing she was only now understanding, standing alone in the humming light with the whole night stretched ahead of her. She had wanted him to lie, to bluster, to give her the familiar enemy, because the familiar enemy was easy and required nothing of her but the well-worn machinery of dislike. What she had gotten instead was a man agreeing with the worst thing she believed about him, and doing it in a voice so tired it had emptied her righteousness out of her hands. She lowered herself to the floor as well, at the opposite end of the aisle, her back to the cold shelves, the length of the vault between them. From here, she could see only the line of his shoulder, the pale edge of his profile turned resolutely to the dark. The lamp burned on. Somewhere above them, the bell had long since finished. Out in the sealed city, the patrols walked their measured rounds, and the doors held, and dawn was a rumour 7 hours off. Two people who had spent 3 years constructing the perfect distance between themselves sat now at opposite ends of a locked room, unable to leave, unable to sleep, unable, for the first time in the whole architecture of their acquaintance, to walk away from the wreckage of what had just been said. Hermione drew her knees up, wrapped her arms around them, and rested her chin there, staring at the iron shelves opposite until the letters on the case spines blurred. She would not apologize. She was almost certain she would not apologize. But she found, as the first hour of the night wore thin, that she could no longer quite remember why being right about him had once felt so much like winning. And in the long silence of the vault, with the man himself sitting 6 yards away and refusing to give her the satisfaction of his face, she discovered she had nothing left to do but sit with the question and wait for a morning that would not come for a very long time. The second night came for them the way weather does, without asking. They had told themselves, both of them, in the grey exhaustion of that first dawn, when the wards finally sighed open and released them blinking into the atrium, that it would not happen again. Hermione had said as much aloud brisk and businesslike over the case files the next afternoon, not looking at him. "We'll finish before the bell. We'll set a charm to warn us." And Malfoy had inclined his head a fraction, agreeing to the fiction, and neither of them had believed it for a moment, because the pre-wet file had grown a second head overnight. 3 more disappearances flagged in the small hours, 3 more empty beds in a locked city, and the work would not be hurried for the sake of 2 people who could not stand to share a room. So when the bell found them again 6 days later, it found them in the records annex 2 floors down, waist deep in a decade of wardlogs, and this time neither of them pretended to be surprised. 1, 2, 3. Hermione did not stop reading. She had decided, somewhere in the intervening week, that the sensible response to being trapped was to behave as though the trap were merely an inconvenient room. 4, 5. She turned a page. 6, 7. And the annex sealed with a sound like a held breath. "Efficient," Malfoy observed from the ladder, where he was balanced against the high shelving with a ledger open across one forearm. "You've stopped flinching. I've stopped wasting the energy." She did not look up. "The bell rings whether I attend to it or not." "A philosophy. How you've grown." He turned a page of his own. The annex was smaller than the vault, meaner, a slot of a room lined floor to ceiling with the leather and iron spines of wardlogs going back to the last war and the one before it. And it had exactly 1 lamp, which meant they were obliged to work near it, which meant they were obliged to work near each other. She was aware of him the way one is aware of a change in air pressure, a low, constant static along the side of her body that faced his. They had not spoken of the vault, not the accusation, not the confession, not the long, silent hours afterward in which she had listened to him not sleeping across the room, and he had listened to her do the same. Some agreement had formed between them without words, that the night had happened in a country with no border to the day, and its currency did not spend here. It was the only mercy either of them knew how to extend, and they extended it by mutual, unspoken vote. An hour passed, then 2. The lamp burned low, and she rose to trim it, and that was when the shelf gave way. It was nothing dramatic. A bracket worn loose by a century of damp, a top row of ledgers overburdened, and the ladder's small shift as Malfoy came down it, the final indignity the old iron would bear. She heard the groan of metal an instant before she understood it. She looked up. The whole upper shelf was leaning out from the wall, slow at first, and then not slow, spilling its freight of heavy books directly above the place where he stood, with his back half turned, unaware, reaching to set his ledger down. She did not decide to move. Her body decided for her, the way it had decided things in the war, in the years when deciding took too long, and the deciding got you killed. She crossed the space between them in a motion she would not afterward be able to reconstruct, and her hand closed on his sleeve, and she pulled. He came off balance toward her with a grunt of surprise, and the first of the ledgers struck the floor where he had been standing with a crack like a curse going off, and the second, and then the whole leaning shelf, let go at once in an avalanche of leather and iron and choking parchment dust, and the 2 of them went down together in an ungainly tangle against the opposite shelving, her back to the cold spines, his weight half against her, the din of the falling books enormous in the small room, and then, all at once, over. silence. The dust hung in the lamplight like something suspended in amber. Her ears rang. She became aware of the particulars slowly, one at a time as the shock ebbed. Her hand was still fisted in his sleeve. His forearm had come up across her, a reflex, a shield thrown out against a danger already past, and lay now against her collarbone, not gripping, simply there, a warm pressure through 2 layers of cloth. His face was very close. She could see the pale flecks in the grey of his eyes, the fine white line of an old scar through one brow that she had never been near enough to notice, the fact that he had stopped breathing. So had she. For a suspended instant, neither of them moved. The static she had been half feeling all night rose to a roar, a thing with a pulse in it, a magnetic drag that had nothing to do with sense. His gaze went, once, helplessly to her mouth, and came back up, and she watched him register that she had seen it. Then she flinched. It was not a decision either. It rose up out of a place beneath decision, a memory she had spent 2 years learning to walk around rather than through. The memory of another fine drawing room and another marble floor, and her own voice coming out of her in a shape she did not recognize, and pale hair, and the name Malfoy ringing off the walls in a woman's voice, and Draco standing at the edge of it all with his eyes on the floor. Her body remembered before her mind could stop it. She flinched from his nearness, the way one flinches from a stove, all at once and without dignity. A full-length recoil that pressed her spine hard into the shelving behind her and put 6 inches of dead air between them that had not been there a breath before. He saw it. Of course, he saw it. He was close enough to feel it happen. Something went out of his face. Some light she had not known was there until it left. He drew back from her at once, taking his forearm from her collarbone, folding himself up and away with a rigid, careful economy, putting distance between their bodies as fast as the wreckage of the shelf would allow. He got to his feet. He did not offer her his hand. "You're not hurt," he said. It was not a question, and it was not gentle. His voice had gone flat and formal, the voice of a man reading a report. "Good. Malfoy." The bracket was corroded. He was already turning away, already crossing to the fallen books, already crouching to gather them with quick, precise movements that let him keep his back to her. "The whole east wall wants replacing. I'll note it in the morning." "I wasn't..." She stopped. Her hands were shaking, she noticed, with a curious detachment. The adrenaline had to go somewhere, and it had chosen her hands. "I didn't mean..." "You don't owe me an explanation." He said it to the floor, to the ledgers, to anything but her. His knuckles had gone white around the spine of the book he held. "I'm the last person on this earth owed one. Sit down. You've had a shock." But she could not let it lie there, ugly and unfinished, between them in the ringing quiet. She had spent the whole week refusing to think about the vault, and now the vault and the drawing room and every other room they had shared and survived came up through the floor of her at once, and she found she was on her feet, and she was speaking before she had chosen the words. "It wasn't you." The lamp threw both their shadows enormous up the wall. The flinch. "It wasn't... I wasn't afraid of you, Malfoy. I was..." She pressed the heel of her hand to her sternum, as though she could hold the thing down. "There's a room in your house. I go back to it. I didn't choose to, and I can't stop. And when you were that close, She could not finish. She had never finished it. Not for Harry, not for Ron, not for the kind-eyed healer the ministry had assigned her in the first year when the nightmares would not let her sleep. She had never once said aloud the plain shape of the thing, and now it was half out of her in a records annex under a broken shelf in front of the one person who had been in the room when it happened. Malfoy had gone very still. He rose slowly from his crouch. The ledger dropped from his fingers to the pile, forgotten. He did not come toward her. He had learned in the last 90 seconds precisely how far he was permitted to come, and he stopped a careful yard short of it. But he turned, at last, and looked at her fully, and the thing in his face was not pity, which she could not have borne, and it was not the smooth contempt she had armoured herself against for 3 years. It was something rawer and more difficult, something with the whole war in it, something that looked impossibly like grief. "I know the room," he said. 3 words. He did not elaborate. He did not defend himself, or explain where he had been standing, or offer the small self-serving mercies she might have expected. "I couldn't have stopped it. I was a boy. I had no wand of my own that night." He offered her nothing but the plain admission that he too walked through that room in the dark, that he too had a door in him that would not stay shut, that the marble and the pale hair and the woman's voice lived behind his eyes as surely as behind hers. "I know the room." And in the saying of it, he gave away the only thing he had left to guard, that he had not forgotten, that he did not get to forget, that the ledger he kept was not a figure of speech. The static between them had changed its charge entirely. It was not desire now, though the memory of desire hung in the dust with everything else. It was recognition, the terrible, unwanted recognition of one haunted person for another, 2 people who had assumed they were alone in their particular dark discovering, in the wreck of a fallen shelf at some black hour of a curfew night, that they had been standing in the same room the whole time. Hermione lowered herself back to the floor among the scattered ledgers. After a moment, at his careful yard's distance, so did he. Neither of them reached for the books. The lamp burned down toward its last inch of oil, and the sealed annex held them, and out in the emptied city the patrols walked their rounds beneath a moonless sky, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all, because there was, for once, nothing left to win, and both of them had felt the ground move beneath the old familiar hatred, and had not, in the end, been able to make it hold. The 3rd time they came prepared, which was its own kind of surrender. Hermione noticed it in the small things. That Malfoy had begun keeping a second coat folded over the back of his chair, heavier than the one he wore in from the street. That a tin had appeared on the corner of their shared desk one morning, plain and unremarked, and that when she had lifted its lid to investigate, she had found it packed with a dark, fragrant coffee she did not recognize. Ground fine, along with a small brass press she had last seen in a Continental catalogue and had assumed no one in England actually owned. He had said nothing about it. She had said nothing about it. But the tin stayed and refilled itself when it ran low, and both of them understood without a word exchanged that they had stopped pretending the nights were an aberration and begun quietly to provision for them. This night took them in the smallest room yet. A warded cubicle off the aura registry, barely more than a cupboard with a table in it, where the sensitive files were read under a permanent caterwauling charm that made whispering pointless and shouting unbearable. They had been chasing a thread all evening, a pattern in the disappearances, a shape that would not quite resolve, victims who had nothing in common until, at 10:30, Hermione had seen it, that each of them had filed a grievance in the months before they vanished against the very statute that now governed the dark. She had looked up to tell him and found the bell already 3 strokes into its work. Neither of them cursed. That too was new. Malfoy simply reached for the brass press and the tin and a jug of water he warmed with a flick of his wand, and set about the small domestic ritual of the coffee as though it were the most natural thing in the world for the 2 of them to be walled up together at midnight. Hermione watched his hands. She had spent 3 years cataloguing everything wrong with those hands. The ring, the pale aristocratic length of them, the fact of what they had and had not done, and found, tonight, that she was too tired to sustain the catalogue. Exhaustion had worn her defences down to the grain. She had been awake for the better part of 2 days, and there is an hour, well past midnight, when the body simply lays its weapons down because it has not the strength to lift them. He set a cup in front of her without a word. She wrapped her hands around it and breathed the steam, and, for the first time in the whole grinding history of their acquaintance, felt something in her chest unclench. "Why do you stay?" he asked. She looked up. He was leaning against the far wall of the cubicle, his own cup untouched in his hands, watching her with an expression she could not read, because it was not one he had ever shown her. Open, or at least unguarded, the shutters that usually hung behind his eyes drawn up for once. "At the ministry," he clarified when she said nothing. "You could have anything. St. Mungo's would build you a wing. The reform commissions send you letters you don't answer. Every publisher in Britain wants the book. And instead, you spend your nights in a cupboard reading ward logs with me, which cannot possibly be anyone's idea of a life well spent." A dry note entered his voice, but the cruelty had gone out of it. I've wondered for months, if I'm honest. You're the only person here who doesn't seem to want to be anywhere else, and I can't work out why." It was such a plain question, asked so plainly that the reflexive parry died in her throat. She turned the cup in her hands and watched the dark surface tilt. "Because I helped build it," she said at last. He waited. "The statute." She swallowed. The coffee was very good. She registered that distantly, the way one registers weather. The curfew, all of it. "I sat on the commission. I drafted the enforcement provisions, the language the patrols use, the schedule of penalties, the appeals process that everyone tells me is too slow, and I keep telling them is the best we could manage. When the disappearances started, everyone in this building wanted to look away, because to look at them properly is to ask whether the thing we made to keep people safe is the thing that's taking them. And I couldn't." She stopped, started again. "I can't leave a thing I built if it might be hurting people. I have to stay and find out. If I walk away and it turns out we made a machine for making people disappear, then Her jaw tightened. "Then it's mine. I don't get to hand it to someone else and go write a book." The caterwauling charm hummed at the edge of hearing. Malfoy was very still. That's a terrible reason, he said quietly, to stay awake for 2 years. It's the only one I have. I know. He looked down into his cup. That's what makes it terrible. Something in the way he said it made her look at him properly. Not the wary, sidelong assessment of 3 years' habit, but a full, tired human look. And she saw, as if for the first time, what the last 2 years had done to him. She had been so busy defending herself against him that she had never once simply looked. There were shadows beneath his eyes that no amount of Malfoy composure could disguise. The fine bones of his face had gone finer, sharpened by sleeplessness into something almost ascetic. His hands, when they were not performing the small, confident rituals he hid behind, had a tremor in them so slight she would have missed it a week ago. "And you?" She heard herself ask. "Why do you stay? You could leave the country. God knows your name isn't doing you any favors here." A short, humorless breath that was almost a laugh. "My name," he said, "is precisely why I can't. Do you imagine anyone would let me go? I'm not here because I want to be, Granger. I'm here because it's the one place they can keep an eye on me while pretending they've forgiven me. And I'm useful enough at the work that the arrangement embarrasses no one too badly." He turned his cup a slow quarter turn against the table. "I am, you understand, on a very long tether. The Aura office is where the ministry keeps its reformed monsters. It lets them watch me sign my life away to their paperwork and call it rehabilitation. And it lets me pretend that the watching is a job, and everyone gets to feel that justice is being served. It's a very civilized arrangement. I hate every hour of it." He said it without self-pity. That was what undid her. Not the confession, but the flatness of it, the way he laid out the architecture of his own cage without once asking her to feel sorry for the man inside it. She had wanted, for 3 years, to believe he was comfortable, that the pardon and the position and the old name buffed to a careful shine meant he had escaped, had slid free, had paid nothing. It was easier to hate a man who had gotten away with it. It was much harder to hate the ones sitting across from her at 2 in the morning, describing his own imprisonment in the tone of a man reading a weather report, drinking coffee he had brought from home because home was the last place in the world he wished to be. "I didn't know," she said. It was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate. "No," he agreed. "Why would you? It isn't the kind of thing one advertises." He finally lifted the cup and drank. "You have your reasons for staying, and I have mine, and they are not, in the end, so very different. We are both here to answer for something we can't quite put down. It's almost funny. Of all the people in this building, the 2 who understand each other least turn out to be the 2 who are here for the same reason." He set the cup down. "I'd laugh, but I'm too tired, and the charm would flatten me." She did laugh, a small, startled, involuntary sound, more breath than voice, gone almost before it arrived. It surprised them both. She saw it register on his face, saw something there she had never once put there in 3 years of well-aimed cruelty. Not triumph, not the satisfaction of a point scored, but a kind of cautious wonder, as though he had not been certain she was capable of the sound and was recalibrating everything on the strength of having heard it. The night wore on around them. The coffee cooled and was warmed again. They did not exactly become friends. The word was too soft for the thing that was happening, and neither of them would have permitted it. But somewhere in the long, dark hours of that third confinement, the war they had been waging changed its nature. They stopped fighting to wound and began, tentatively, warily, to simply talk, the way people talk when they are too tired to perform, and there is nowhere to go, and the person across the table has just told you a true thing about themselves and is waiting, without much hope, to see whether you will use it against them. She did not use it against him. She found she did not want to. And when, near the grey edge of morning, she looked up from a ward log and caught him already looking at her, not the flinch and look away of a man caught trespassing, but a steady, thoughtful regard, as though she were a text he had assumed he'd finished and was now discovering he had misread on every page. She did not glance away either. She held it. For one long moment across a cupboard in the belly of the ministry, with the caterwauling charm humming and the coffee gone cold and the whole sealed city asleep above them, Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy simply looked at one another, and neither of them could have said afterward which of them looked away first, or whether, in the end, either of them did at all before the wards sighed open on the dawn. The fourth night did not begin in the ministry at all. The thread Hermione had pulled loose in the warded cubicle had unravelled fast once she had her hands in it. Every victim, a grievance filed. Every grievance routed through a single sub-office for review before the appeal could proceed. And every appeal, she discovered, cross-checking the dates with a cold spreading slowly through her chest, denied within days of the filer's disappearance. Someone inside the machine was reading the complaints against the curfew and making the complainers vanish, one careful bureaucratic murder at a time, and doing it under cover of the very law that emptied the streets each night so that no one would be out to witness it. They had taken it to Robards. Robards had gone grey and quiet and told them to sit on it until he could bring it to the minister without the whole office learning first. And he had sent them, that same evening, to a ministry safe house on the Yorkshire moors, a low stone cottage under a hard scatter of stars, warded to the rafters, to hold a witness who had come forward, a clerk from the sub-office, frightened half out of his skin, who claimed he could name the hand behind the denials and wanted protection before he'd say it aloud. The clerk never arrived. They understood what that meant somewhere around 11, when the flue went dead and the wards on the cottage lit up along the window frames in a slow, sickly green they both recognized from the war. Someone had followed the thread back to them. Someone did not intend for the clerk to testify, or for the two investigators sent to shelter him to see the morning. "Curfew's rung," Malfoy said. He had his wand out. His voice had gone very calm, the particular calm she now knew he wore over the worst of it, and his eyes were moving over the windows in a fast professional sweep. "Whoever's out there is breaking the same law we can't, which means they're not afraid of the patrols, which means they are the patrols, or near enough to borrow the authority." "How many?" "3 that I can feel. Perhaps 4. He looked at her, and for once there was no distance in it at all, no old grievance, nothing but the flat, clear focus of a man who had survived one war by paying attention. "The wards will hold a while, not till dawn. They're peeling them one layer at a time. Do you feel it? That pressure behind the eyes. She felt it. The atmospheric weight of hostile magic massing against the stone, a slow barometric drop that pressed on the sinuses and set the teeth faintly on edge. She had felt it before. Her body remembered what it was for. "The back room has no windows," she said. "Stone on 3 sides. If they breach the front, we fall back there and make them come single file through the door." He nodded once, and something passed between them in the nod. An old current, wartime current, the wordless coordination of 2 people who had each spent their adolescence learning to stay alive. They had never fought on the same side. It occurred to her with a strange lurch that she had no idea whether they could. They were about to find out. The first ward went with a sound like ice breaking on a deep lake, a low resonant crack that came up through the soles of their feet. Then the second. The green light at the windows brightened, guttered, brightened again. Hermione moved without being told, killing the lamps with a sweep of her wand so that they would not be silhouetted. And the cottage dropped into a darkness broken only by that seeping green and the hard white stars through the glass. "Granger!" "I'm here. When they come." He was close beside her now in the dark, his shoulder nearly at hers, his voice pitched low beneath the groan of the failing wards. "They'll lead with something loud to make us move. Don't move. The loud thing is never the one that kills you. It's the quiet one behind it. I know how an ambush works. I know you do." A pause. In the green half-light, she could just make out the line of his profile, the tension in his jaw. "I'm saying it so I don't have to think about the rest of it. Forgive me. I talk when I'm frightened. It's a failing." It was such an unexpectedly human admission, offered in the last quiet seconds before violence, that it steadied her more than any tactical instruction could have. "Then talk," she said. "I'll cover the door." The last ward broke. What came through the front of the cottage came fast. A battering hex that took the door off its hinges in a spray of splinters and stone dust. Exactly the loud thing he had promised, and every nerve in her body screamed at her to answer it, and she did not. And a half-second later, the quiet thing came low through the debris, a sickly yellow curse skimming at knee-height that would have taken her legs out from under her if she had flinched toward the noise. She dropped it with the shield an inch off the floor. Beside her, Malfoy's wand was already moving, and the first figure through the ruined doorway went down hard and did not get up. Then there was no more time for thought. She would remember it afterward in fragments, the way one remembers the worst hours. The strobe of curse light off the whitewashed walls, the smell of ozone and scorched stone thickening the air until each breath tasted of a struck match. The grunt of effort beside her, the way they fell back through the cottage toward the windowless room without ever once having to say so. Each of them somehow knowing where the other was, covering the angle the other could not. A two-bodied thing moving through the dark. She had never fought beside him. She had assumed, in whatever idle corner of her mind had ever considered it, that they would foul each other, that 3 years of working at cross purposes would express itself in tangled wands and mistimed shields. Instead, they meshed like they had drilled it for years. He read her movements a beat before she made them. She felt him about to shift and shifted to make room. When a hex slipped her guard and came for her blind side, his shield was already there, thrown across her without his eyes ever leaving his own quarter of the fight. And she heard him say her name. Not a warning, just her name. Granger, low and certain, the sound a person makes to confirm the other is still standing. And she answered it with his, Malfoy. And it was the first time in either of their mouths that the name had held no venom at all. They made the back room. They put the stone at their backs. And when the last two attackers tried to force the single door together, the two people inside met them as one thing with two wands. And it was over in a hard, bright flurry. And then there was silence. And the green light was gone from the windows, because there was no one left outside to cast it, and the only sound in the world was the two of them breathing. They were pressed shoulder to shoulder against the back wall. Neither had moved. The adrenaline was still roaring through her, a physical tide, and she could feel the same current in him where their arms touched, the fine, violent tremor of a body that has just been asked to fight for its life and does not yet believe the fighting is done. She turned her head. He was already turning his. In the dark of the windowless room, with the smell of ozone hanging and the dead men beyond the door, and both their hearts slamming against their ribs, they looked at each other from 4 inches apart, and this time she did not flinch. That was the thing she noticed first, the thing that mattered more than any of it, that when his nearness registered, her body did not recoil. The room in his house did not rise up between them. There was only this room, this stone at her back, and this shoulder against hers, and this man who had just thrown a shield across her body without being asked, whose profile in the starlight was not the pale, sneering mask of 3 years' careful hatred, but something exhausted and alive, and looking at her as though she were the only fixed point left in a world that had just tried to end them both. His breathing had gone strange. So had hers. The static that had been building between them across 4 sealed nights had found in the aftermath of shared danger a place to Earth itself. A magnetic drag so strong now it was nearly gravitational, drawing the 4 inches down to 3 to 2. Her gaze dropping to his mouth the way his had dropped to hers in the fallen shelf dust, and rising and finding him already watching her do it. Neither of them moved to close it. That was the exquisite, agonizing thing. They stood at the very lip of it, breath mingling in the dark, every nerve she owned straining toward the small remaining distance. And some last exhausted sentinel in each of them held the line, because to cross it now, adrenaline drunk and death adjacent, would be to blame it on the fight in the morning, and something in both of them, some newly tender and unspoken thing, did not want it to be blamable, did not want it to be an accident, did not want the first time they reached for each other to be a thing they could later pretend the war had done. So they stood there, trembling, a breath apart, neither advancing and neither retreating, the whole ruined night gone silent around them, until Hermione's hand, of its own accord, without permission, without her consent, rose in the dark and closed around the front of his robes, not pulling him in, not pushing him away, simply holding, a fist full of fabric over his hammering heart, as though to keep him exactly where he was, in the last inch before everything changed, for one more breath before either of them had to decide what came after. They did not cross it in the end. The moment held them at its edge and then released them. A shudder went through him, or through her, and by some unspoken accord, they stepped back from the brink into the cold aftermath of the fight. And there was a witness to move, and a report to send, and dead men to identify. And the machinery of duty came up around them like a tide, and carried the moment out to sea before either had to name it. But it did not drown. She felt it all the next week, submerged and glowing, every time he passed her in a corridor or set a cup at her elbow. The 4 inches, her fist in his robes. The thing they had not done, more present between them than anything they had. The 5th night found them back in the vault where it had all begun. There was a symmetry to it she did not care for. They had returned to cross-reference the dead attackers' service records against the sub-office roster. Robards moving carefully now, the investigation gone quiet and dangerous. The 2 of them working the files after hours, because after hours was the only time the building was empty enough to trust. The bell caught them among the same iron shelves, under the same single lamp. And this time, when it rang, neither of them so much as looked up. And Hermione understood that the trap had stopped being a trap. It had become, without her noticing the moment of conversion, simply the place where the truest hours of her life now happened. The vault was cold. That was her excuse, later, for what followed, though she knew even as she reached for it that it was a lie. The preservation charms kept the air dry and chill to protect the parchment, and Malfoy, working the high shelves, had shed his outer robe an hour in because the ladder work warmed him, and it was while he was reaching, stretched up to draw a service ledger from the top row, his shirt sleeve fallen back with the motion, that she saw it. She had known it was there. Of course she had known. Everyone knew. It was a fact about him she had filed away years ago in the great cold ledger of reasons to keep her distance. An abstraction, a word, the mark. She had never seen it. She realized now, staring, that she had never once let herself imagine it as a thing on a body, on skin, on his skin. The actual physical fact of it, faded now to the grey-green of an old bruise, the snake still threading through the skull's jaw, the whole of it stretched over the working muscle of his forearm as he reached, ordinary and monstrous and healed over, a scar like any scar, a wound that had closed around the thing that made it. He felt her looking. She saw the moment it reached him, the small hitch in his reach, the way his whole body went still on the ladder. And then he did the thing she would remember for the rest of her life. He did not yank the sleeve down. That was what broke something open in her. He could have. The reflex would have been the work of an instant, the practiced twitch of a man who had spent years keeping that forearm covered, turning it from the light, angling his body so that no one would have to see, and he would not have to watch them see. She had witnessed him do smaller versions of it 100 times without understanding what she was watching. But now, caught, with her eyes full on the mark and the lamp throwing it into pitiless relief, he held himself still on the ladder and let her look, and turned his head and met her eyes, and in his face was not the flinch of a man exposed, but the terrible, steady openness of one who has decided to stop hiding, the worst thing about himself from the one person he can no longer bear to lie to. "Go on," he said quietly. "You've earned a proper look. 3 years you've been imagining it. It's smaller than the version you carry, I expect. They always are." She came toward the ladder. She did not decide to. She was simply moving, the way she had moved to pull him from under the falling shelf, her body ahead of her sense. He came down the last 2 rungs slowly, watching her the way one watches a wild thing approach, holding very still so as not to frighten it off. And when his feet touched the stone, he stood before her with his forearm bare and did not cover it, and the caterwauling hum of the vault filled the silence where words should have been. "Does it hurt?" she asked. It was not the question she had meant to ask. She had not meant to ask anything. Not anymore. His voice had gone rough. It burned. For years. When he called, when he was near, it woke. I used to think... He stopped. His jaw worked. "It's quiet now. Has been since he died. It's just a scar. A very ugly scar with a great deal of history, but a scar. I stopped being able to feel it the day I stopped having to." She was close now. Close enough to see the fine hairs on his forearm, the pale skin, the grey-green ruin of the thing branded into it when he had been a boy of 16 with a father in prison and a wand pointed at his mother's throat. She had spent 3 years building him into a villain because a villain was clean. A villain was easy. A villain could be hated at a safe distance without any cost to the hater. And here was the truth of him, held out to her under a vault lamp at some black hour of the night. Not a villain, not a monster, just a person who had been branded before he was old enough to know what branding meant, and had carried it ever since the way she carried her own room in his house. A scar that closed, but never quite stopped aching. A thing done to a child that the child would spend his whole life answering for. She lifted her hand. She saw him understand what she meant to do a half-second before she did it, and she saw him brace, the whole body tightening, the breath stopping, the eyes going wide and wary, as though she might be about to strike after all, as though some part of him had always expected that the reckoning would come as a blow and was almost relieved to have it arrive at last. He did not pull away. That was the thing. He stood and let her, whatever it was going to be, because he had decided he did not get to flinch from her, of all people, no matter what she did. She laid her fingers against the mark. The skin was warm. That undid her more than anything. That it was warm, that it was living skin, that under her fingertips the monstrous thing was only a man's forearm with a man's pulse beating steady beneath it. She had imagined, without ever letting herself know she was imagining it, that it would be cold, that it would be other, that touching it would be like touching the war itself. Instead, it was warm, and it was his, and he was trembling now, a fine tremor running the length of the arm beneath her hand. And when she looked up from the mark to his face, she found that his eyes had gone bright and stricken, and he was holding himself together by a thread she could see fraying. Nobody had touched it. She understood that, suddenly and completely, in the way she was given to understand true things all at once. In all the years since it was burned into him, no one had ever simply reached out and laid a hand on it as though it was skin, as though it were part of him and not the sum of him, as though the person wearing it were a man and not a warning. His mother would have wept over it. His father would have looked away. Every healer, every aura, every witch and wizard who had ever glimpsed it had done exactly what she had spent 3 years doing. Turned it into a fact, a category, a reason. And here she was, the last person on earth he would have expected to grant it, holding his branded arm in her 2 hands in a locked vault, and looking at him with something in her face that was not fear, and was not judgment, and was not even quite forgiveness. Because forgiveness was hers to give, and this was something else, something she had no word for, something closer to, I see it, and I see you, and they are not the same thing, and I am not letting go. Granger. Her name came out of him cracked down the middle. You don't have to. I know I don't. Her thumb moved once, slowly, across the faded snake. That's rather the point, isn't it? He made a sound then that she had never heard from him and would never forget. Not a sob. He was too proud for a sob. But the thing that lives just underneath one, the raw catch of breath of a man whose defenses have all been reached at once, and who does not, for the length of a single held moment, know how to keep standing under the weight of being seen. His free hand came up. She thought he meant to take her wrist, to move her hand away, to end it. Instead, his fingers closed over hers, where they lay against the mark, pressing them there, holding her palm flat to the scar, keeping her hand exactly where it was, as though he could not bear for it to leave, as though it were the first mercy his forearm had been shown in 20 years, and he meant to keep it a moment longer before the world took it back. They stood like that, joined at the ruin of him, in the humming cold of the vault. The lamp burned steady. The city slept its guilty sleep above them. And Hermione Granger, who had come into this room 5 nights ago, wanting only to prove herself right about the coward Draco Malfoy, stood now with her hand pressed to the worst wound the war had left on him, and understood, with a certainty that emptied all the old hatred out of her at once, and left something vast and frightening in its place, that she could never again pretend to herself that she felt nothing when she looked at him, that the thing between them had crossed in the dark some line past which there was no returning, and that whatever came next, it would not be, could never again be, the safe, clean war they had waged so faithfully for so long. The storm came in off the moors on the 6th night, and did not let them pretend the vault had never happened. Robards had sent them back to the Yorkshire cottage, repaired now, rewarded, the shattered door replaced with oak and iron, to sit with the recovered evidence while the arrests were arranged. The hand behind the disappearances had a name at last, a name high enough that moving on it required the minister's own signature. And until that signature was dry, the 2 of them were to guard what they had found from a low stone house on the edge of nowhere, with the nearest flue 3 miles off across country, and the curfew binding the dark as tight as ever. The rain began at dusk, and by the tolling of the bell had become a living thing. It came down in ropes against the windows, driven flat by a wind that found every gap in the old stone and made the wards sing along their seams. The single hearth threw a restless orange light that could not reach the corners of the room. Candles guttered in the draught. Beyond the streaming glass, the moor had vanished into a churning grey nothing, and the whole world had contracted to this one warm room, and the two people in it, and the drumming of the water, and the low, continuous voice of the wind. They had run out of work by 10. That was the trouble. The evidence was catalogued, the wards checked twice, the reports sent, and there was nothing left to hide behind. No ledger to bury her eyes in, no shelf for him to climb, no case to make the silence permissible. There was only the fire and the rain, and the memory of her hand pressed to his forearm, hanging in the air between them, so thick she could scarcely breathe around it. He had not spoken of it, neither had she, but it had changed the very weight of the air they shared. She was aware of him now with a completeness that had nothing to do with wariness. Aware of him the way one is aware of a lit window in a dark house, drawn to it, warmed by it, unable to look anywhere else for long. He sat across the hearth from her in the one good chair, a glass of something amber untouched at his elbow, watching the fire, and the firelight moved on the planes of his face and turned his pale hair to the colour of struck brass. And she looked at him and felt the whole architecture of 3 years' hatred lying in rubble somewhere behind her, and did not mourn it. "You're staring," he said, without turning his head. "I know." That made him look. The directness of it. She had not deflected, had not reached for the old parry, caught him off guard, and for a moment the firelight showed her the naked question in his face before he mastered it. He set his jaw. He looked back at the fire. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" "Whatever this is, don't." His hand tightened on the arm of the chair, the knuckles paling. "You're grateful, or you feel sorry for me, which is worse. You saw the mark and you touched it because you're the bravest and kindest person I've ever had the misfortune to be despised by. And now you're sitting there feeling something you've mistaken for." He stopped. His voice had gone rough. "Don't. I'd rather you hated me. I know how to survive being hated by you. I've built an entire life on it. I don't know how to survive the other thing, and I would very much prefer not to learn." The rain hammered the glass. A log shifted in the grate and threw up a fountain of sparks. "You think it's pity," she said. "I think it would be very like you to confuse the two." "I've hated you for 3 years, Malfoy." She leaned forward. The firelight was on her now, and she let it be. Let him see her face fully for once. "I know exactly what I feel when I look at you. I've felt it every day since we were children. It's specific. It has a shape. And I'm telling you that whatever I felt in that vault, it was not the shape of hating you, and it was not the shape of pity either, because I have never in my life pitied a person and been unable to stop looking at their mouth while I did it." The words were out. She heard them land. She watched them go through him like a current, watched his careful composure crack straight down the middle, watched the glass tremble minutely in the hand that reached for it, and stopped halfway and dropped back to the chair. "That's not," he began, and could not finish it. "You brought me coffee," she said, "for a month, in a tin, so I wouldn't have to thank you. You keep a second coat so I can borrow it when the vault gets cold, and you fold it over the chair on my side, and you've never once mentioned it. When the shelf fell, you put your arm across me before you knew what was falling. In the cottage, you threw a shield over my blind side without looking. in the middle of fighting for your own life. You did all of that, and you're sitting there telling me not to feel anything, as though you haven't spent 5 nights showing me exactly what you feel and hoping I was too proud to notice. Her voice caught. She pushed through it. I noticed, Draco. I've been noticing for weeks. I just didn't have a name for it that I was willing to say out loud. The sound of his given name in her mouth did something to him. She saw it hit, saw him close his eyes against it, as though it were both the thing he most wanted and the thing he least dared believe he was allowed. When he opened them again, they were bright in the firelight, and his composure was gone entirely, stripped away, nothing left but the man underneath it, looking at her across the small warm space, with a hunger and a terror so nakedly mingled that she felt it answer in her own chest. "If I let myself believe you," he said, very low, "and I am wrong." He shook his head once. "You don't know what it would do to me. To have this, and be wrong about it. I have very little left, Granger. I have my work and my tether, and the certainty that no one will ever look at me the way you're looking at me right now. And I have built a life I can bear on the foundation of that certainty. And if you take it away and it turns out you didn't mean—" His voice broke clean through. "I can't. Do you understand? I can't want this and lose it. It would be the end of me. So please, if there is any mercy in you, don't offer me a thing you're going to take back in the morning." She rose from her chair. She crossed the small space between the 2 hearthside chairs, 3 steps, the fire on one side of her and the drumming dark on the other, and she stopped before him where he sat, close enough that her knees nearly touched his, close enough that he had to tip his head back to keep her eyes, and she watched the breath go out of him. He did not move. His hands gripped the arms of the chair as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. The whole storm had contracted to the 18 inches between his upturned face and hers. "I'm not going to take it back," she said. "Not in the morning. Not in any morning. I've thought about it for 5 nights, and I've stopped being able to think about anything else. And I am done, Draco. I am so completely done pretending I feel nothing." Her hand rose. She laid it against the side of his face and felt him shudder under her palm the way his forearm had shuddered under her fingers in the vault, and watched his eyes fall shut and felt the wetness at the corner of one of them meet the edge of her thumb. "Look at me. Open your eyes and look at me. And tell me you don't want this, and I'll go back to my chair and will never speak of it again. But look at me while you do it. You owe me that much. You've never once been able to lie to my face." His eyes opened. He looked at her. The rain came down and the fire burned, and the wind sang in the wards, and Draco Malfoy looked up at Hermione Granger from a hand's breadth away with 3 years of hunger and a lifetime of loneliness, and every guarded thing he had ever felt written plain across his ruined composure, and he tried to say it. She watched him try. She watched him gather the old lie, the safe lie, the lie that would send her back to her chair and keep his careful, bearable life intact. And she watched it die in his throat unspoken, because he could not, when it came to it, look at her and say he did not want her, because it was not true, and he had never in his life been able to lie to her face. His hand rose instead. It came up slowly, trembling, and closed over hers where it lay against his cheek, and turned and pressed his lips once to the center of her palm, a thing so tender and so unlike anything she had ever expected from him that her breath left her all at once. And then he drew her hand away from his face and held it against his chest, over the hard, fast knocking of his heart, and looked up at her with his eyes streaming and his mouth working, and no lie left anywhere in him. And still, even now, even with everything laid bare between them, he did not close the last of the distance himself, because he had decided long ago that he did not get to reach for her, that the reaching had to be hers, that after everything he had been and done, he could accept but never take. And so he simply held her hand to his hammering heart and waited, trembling, undone, for her to decide whether to bridge the final breath between them or to step back into the safe, cold dark forever. She stepped back. She would spend a long time afterward trying to understand why. It was not that she had stopped wanting him. Want was not the difficulty. It was that she had stood there with his heart hammering under her palm and his tears on her thumb, and his whole ruined self held up to her like an offering, and the very completeness of it had frightened her. The sheer irrevocable weight of what stepping forward would mean, the way it would rewrite everything, the way there would be no going back to any life she recognized. She had built herself over 3 years into a person with hard, clean edges. She had known exactly who she was in relation to Draco Malfoy, his opposite, his adversary, the fixed star he was measured against. To close that final breath was to dissolve the boundary that had defined her, and some frightened animal part of her had recoiled from the dissolving, the way she had recoiled from him under the fallen shelf, all at once, without dignity, before her better self could intervene. She stepped back and she watched it destroy him. He did not cry out. He was too proud for that even now. But she saw the light go out of his face the way it had gone out in the annex, only worse, so much worse, because this time she had let him hope first. She watched him gather the shattered pieces of his composure with hands that shook, watched him release her hand and set it gently away from his chest as though returning something borrowed, watched him rise from the chair and turn from her toward the fire so that she would not have to see his face, and the courtesy of that even now, even in the wreck of it, his first instinct was to spare her the sight of what she had done, was worse than any accusation could have been. "Of course," he said. His voice had gone flat and formal, the report-reading voice, the armor she had thought was gone for good, sliding back into place, plate by plate. "Forgive me. I overstepped. It's late, and we've both been under a great strain, and I—" He stopped, started again. "You should take the bed. I'll sit up. I don't sleep well in strange houses in any case." "Draco, don't." The word came out of him like a struck flint. He did not turn around. "Please, whatever you're about to say to make it kind, don't. I would genuinely rather you didn't. There is a version of tonight I can survive if we simply agree it didn't happen, and there is a version I cannot survive at all, and the difference between them is whether you make me listen to you be gentle about it. So I am asking you, as the one mercy I will ever ask of you, let it not have happened. Take the bed. We'll speak of the case in the morning, and nothing else, ever. And in a week, it will be as though—" "Stop telling me what I feel." It came out harder than she meant it, whipped out of her by the sheer frustration of watching him decide her heart for her. And she saw his shoulders flinch at the lash of it, and she was instantly, coldly sorry. But the thing was said, and into the silence after it, some old, dreadful machinery in both of them woke and began to turn. The machinery of 3 years' warfare, so much easier to run than the terrifying new thing they had almost built. And she felt herself reaching for it, even as she despised herself for reaching, because it was familiar, because it was safe, because a fight she knew how to have was infinitely less frightening than a tenderness she did not. He turned around then, and the thing in his face was the old thing. The shutters, the frost, the flat grey contempt she had spent 5 nights watching him shed. And she understood that he had reached for the same machinery, that they were both retreating into the war, because the war was the only ground either of them had ever learned to stand on together. "You want to know what I feel," he said, and his voice had gone silken and cruel, the voice from the very first night, honed now by knowing exactly where she was, soft. "I feel foolish. I feel like a man who mistook curiosity for something warmer, because a clever woman got bored on a string of long nights and found the reformed monster more interesting than she expected. You touched the mark because you're a scholar of terrible things, and I was a terrible thing you'd never got to examine up close. That's all it ever was. I let myself forget it for an hour. You've reminded me. I'm grateful, in fact. It's cleaner this way." Every word of it was a lie, and she knew it was a lie, and it went into her anyway, because the cruelest lies are the ones cut from the cloth of your own worst fear, and he had always known precisely where to cut. "That's not fair," she said, and hated how thin it came out. "Fairness?" He gave a short, terrible laugh. "You want to talk to me about fairness? You who spent 3 years deciding exactly what I was before I'd said a word each morning. You who flinched from me on the floor of the annex as though I were the one who put my aunt's knife." He stopped himself. Too late. She saw him see it was too late. The word hung in the room, jagged, unforgivable. The thing neither of them had ever named aloud in 5 nights of naming everything else, and it had come out of him in the heat of retreat. A weapon grabbed off the wall without looking, and she watched the horror of it reach his own face a half-second after it reached hers. "Granger!" But she was already up. She had risen without deciding to, her chair scraping back, her whole body one cold ringing wound, and the tears that came were not the soft kind, but the furious kind, the kind that shamed her by arriving unbidden in front of the one person she most needed to appear unbreakable before. "Yes," she said, and her voice shook, and she let it. "As though you were the one who did it. You weren't. I know you weren't. I have never once thought you were. Not in 3 years, not for a single hour. But you watched, Draco. You stood in that room and you watched, and you looked at the floor. And do you know what I have never been able to forgive? Not the watching. I've made my peace with the watching. You were a frightened boy, and there was a wand on your mother. What I have never been able to forgive is that you were the only other person in that house who knew what was happening, was wrong. And I was on the floor, and I looked at you. I looked right at you. And for half a second you looked back, and I actually thought, He's going to do something. And you didn't. And I've hated you for 3 years. Not because I thought you were a monster, but because for half a second I thought you weren't. And then you proved me wrong. And it turns out the thing I couldn't forgive was hope. The rain filled the silence. The fire cracked. Neither of them moved. She had never said it. In 3 years, through the healers and the nightmares and the long cold campaign of dislike, she had never once let herself know the true shape of the wound. And here it was, torn out of her in a firelit cottage on the moors, laid bleeding on the floor between them. Not hatred at all. Hope. The unbearable memory of having looked into his face at the worst moment of her life and found, for half a second, a person who understood. And the far worse memory of watching that person do nothing and learning at 16 on a marble floor that understanding and courage were not the same thing, and that the gap between them was where people like her were left to scream. Draco had gone white to the lips. The cruelty had drained out of his face entirely, and what replaced it was so much worse. A naked, unguarded devastation, the look of a man hearing for the first time the true cost of the worst thing he had ever failed to do. "I have wanted to do something in that room," he said, and his voice was barely above the rain. "Every night for 3 years. I do it in my sleep. I cross the floor. I put myself between you and her. I take the knife. I have taken that knife 10,000 times in the dark, Hermione, and I wake up every morning to the one unalterable fact that I did not take it when it would have counted, when you were looking at me, when there was still time." His hands hung open and empty at his sides. "You thought, for half a second, that I was going to do something. You were not wrong to think it. Every decent thing in me was screaming to do it. I simply—" His voice failed. He forced it on. "I was a coward. You said it the first night, and you were right, and I have never once disputed it. The only thing I would add, the only defense I have ever been able to muster, is that I have been paying for that half-second every single day since, and I will go on paying for it until I die, and it will never, ever be enough. And I know that, and I do not ask you to think it is." They stood 6 feet apart in the firelight, both of them wet-faced, both of them stripped past the last of their armor, the storm hammering the glass, and the wound of the war lying open on the floor between them at last, fully named for the first time by both, and neither of them, in the terrible ringing silence that followed, could find the way across it, because the thing between them had finally been spoken whole, and now they had to live inside the truth of it, and neither of them yet knew whether the truth was a wall or a door. The arrests came at dawn, and they nearly cost him everything. Neither of them had slept. They had passed the rest of that terrible night in separate silences. She in the bed she had not asked for, staring at the low-beamed ceiling while the storm blew itself out. He in the good chair by the dying fire, upright, sleepless, keeping a watch no one had asked him to keep. By morning, the rain had gone and left the moor washed and glittering under a hard, clean sky, and the flue had come alive at first light with Robard's grim face in the flames. The minister had signed. The hand behind the disappearances had a name, and the name was Corbin Yaxley's cousin, a career man in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, named Aldous Yaxley, who had spent 2 years quietly murdering everyone who complained about a curfew he had helped design. And the arrest was happening now, this hour, and they were needed. What no one had told them, what Robards himself had not known, was that Aldous Yaxley had friends inside the Aura office, and that one of them had reached the cottage's evidence before the arrest team did, and had left something behind in the rewarded stone that was waiting, patient and lethal, for the 2 witnesses to come and collect what they had gathered. Hermione saw it a half-second too late. The evidence chest sat where they had left it, innocent in the morning light, and she crossed to it to gather the sealed depositions for the flue, and her hand was already on the lid when she registered the thing she should have seen the instant she woke: the faint, oily shimmer over the iron clasp, the smell beneath the smell of rain, ozone, and something sweeter and far worse. A curse trap laid to take the hands and the face of whoever opened it, keyed to trigger the moment the lid rose past the 1st inch. She had opened it a 1/4 inch. Down. She did not know whose voice it was. She learned, in the fractured instant that followed, that it had been his, because it was his body that reached her. Draco crossing the room in a single motion faster than thought, his shoulder taking her full in the side and driving her clear of the chest, the 2 of them going down hard against the stone floor in a tangle of limbs as the trap let go behind them with a sound like the sky tearing. Heat washed over her back. Something struck the wall above them and cracked the stone. And then they were down, and he was over her, his body a shield across hers, his arms bracketing her head, and the roar of the sprung curse rang and rang in the small room, and slowly, slowly faded. And there was only the 2 of them on the floor, and the smell of scorched iron and his weight over her, and his breath ragged in her ear. "You're hurt," she said. She could feel it. A wrongness in the arm braced beside her head, a tremor that was not fear. "Draco, your arm." "It's nothing." It was not nothing. When he pushed himself up off her, she saw the sleeve of his right arm shredded and blackened, the curse having caught him across the forearm as he turned to take the blast off her. The right forearm she registered with a lurch, not the marked one, some blind unfair mercy in that. And beneath the burned cloth, the skin was raw and blistering, an ugly seeping wound that had bought her whole face and both her hands with the flesh of his arm. He had not hesitated. That was the thing she could not get past, kneeling over him on the cold stone, while he insisted through gritted teeth that it was nothing. There had been no half-second this time, no looking at the floor. He had heard the trap, and he had crossed the room, and he had put his own body between her and the harm without a flicker of the paralysis that had haunted him for 3 years. And he had done it so fast and so completely that he had never once, she understood, even considered doing otherwise. That somewhere in the long nights of their confinement, the frightened boy who looked at the floor had become a man who moved toward the danger without being asked, and had just proven it in the only currency that had ever counted between them, and did not seem to know he had proven anything at all. "You crossed the room," she said. Her hands were on the ruined arm, casting the field-healing charms Harry had drilled into her in another war, and her voice was not steady. "You heard it, and you crossed the room." "Of course I crossed the room." He was pale with the pain of it, sweat standing on his brow, and he looked at her as though she had said something incomprehensible. "It was going to take your hands. What did you imagine I was going to do?" "Look at the floor," she said. "You imagined it. For 3 years. In your sleep, you cross the room and take the knife, and you never believe you'll do it when it's real. And it was real. And you crossed the room." She watched it reach him, watched him understand at last, kneeling on the scorched stone with his arm laid open in her hands, that the thing he had been trying and failing to do in 10,000 dreams he had just done, awake, without thinking, without hesitating, without any wand on his mother's throat to excuse the cowardice or compel the courage. He had simply moved because it was her, and the moving had been the truest sentence his whole ruined life had ever spoken. She saw the knowledge break over his face, and she saw that he did not know what to do with it, that it was too large, that a wound 3 years deep had just been given the one thing that could touch it, and he did not yet believe he was allowed to feel it heal. "Hermione." Her name came out of him wrecked. "I said an unforgivable thing to you last night, about the knife, about your—" His jaw worked. "There is no excuse for it. I reached for the cruelest thing I could find because I was terrified of how much I wanted the other thing, and I have hated myself since the words left my mouth, and I need you to know that before. I know why you said it." Her charms had sealed the worst of the burn. The raw flesh had knit to an angry pink. The bleeding stopped. She kept her hands on his arm though the work was done, because she could not quite make herself let go. "I said something cruel too. We're very good at it. 3 years of practice." She looked up from the arm to his face, close now, both of them kneeling on the floor of the ruined room with the morning light pouring clean through the window. "But you didn't look at the floor, Draco. When it was real, when it was me, you crossed the room. And I don't think you understand what that means, so I'm going to have to be the one to say it, since apparently you'll spend the rest of your life not believing it on your own." "Hermione." "You're forgiven," she said. "Not for last night, for the room, for the marble floor and the half-second, and the hope you couldn't answer when we were children. All of it. I forgive you. I've been trying to work out how to stop hating you for 3 years, and it turns out all it took was watching you throw yourself across a curse for me without stopping to be afraid first. So it's done. It's over. You can put it down now. You've paid enough. You paid it just now with your arm, and you'd have paid it with a great deal more. And I am telling you, as the person you've been paying it to, that the debt is settled and you are free." He made the sound again, the one from the vault, the raw catch that lived beneath a sob. And this time it broke all the way. And Draco Malfoy, who was too proud to weep, wept, kneeling on the floor of a stone cottage with his arm in her hands, and 3 years of carried weight coming off him all at once. And she gathered him in without deciding to, her arms going around him, his face going into the curve of her neck. The two of them folded together on the scorched stone in the clean morning light, with the storm blown out and the curse spent, and nothing left between them at all. And then she drew back, just far enough to see him, his eyes streaming, his composure gone past any recovering, his mouth open on some word he could not find. And she did the thing she had failed to do in the firelight, the thing she had stepped back from, the last breath she had not been able to cross. She crossed it. She took his ruined face in both her hands, and she closed the distance herself, because she had learned that he would never take it, that he had decided long ago he did not get to reach for her, that after everything the reaching had to be hers. And so she reached, and she pressed her mouth to his, and the whole world contracted to the warmth of it, to the small broken sound he made against her lips, to the way his uninjured hand came up at last and buried itself in her hair as though he had been drowning for 3 years and had only now been given air. He kissed her back like a man who had never believed he would be permitted to, careful and desperate and disbelieving all at once. And she felt the last of the war go out of both of them, felt the old cold distance dissolve at last in the heat of a kiss she had been walking toward. She understood now, since the first stroke of the very first bell. The morning light lay gold across the floor. The city beyond the moor was waking to the news of arrests, of a curfew's architect dragged into the light, of a long dark loosening at last. And in a stone cottage under a washed clean sky, kneeling in the wreckage of the thing that had nearly killed them both, Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy held each other and kissed and wept and did not let go. 2 people who had found each other in the dark of a locked country and had just, in the first clean light of morning, chosen to keep what they had found. The emergency statute was lifted on a Thursday 6 weeks later, and the whole of magical Britain held its breath to watch the doors of the dark swing open. It was Hermione's testimony that ended it. She had stood before the reconvened Wizengamot with the evidence she and Draco had gathered laid out in careful rows, and she had told them what the curfew had become in the hands of the man who had helped her build it. How a thing made to keep people safe had been turned into a machine for making inconvenient people disappear. How the emptied streets that were meant to protect the frightened had instead given cover to their murder. She had not spared herself. She had named her own hand in the drafting, her own signature on the enforcement provisions, and she had told them that a law which could be turned so easily to such an end was a law that could not be trusted to anyone, however good their intentions, and that the only safe curfew was the one that no longer existed. Aldous Yaxley was already in a cell. The statute followed him into history by a vote that was not close. And so, on that Thursday evening, for the first time in more than 2 years, the curfew bell did not ring. Hermione stood at the window of her flat and waited for it anyway. Old habit. Her body had learned to brace against that bronze weight every evening at dusk, to count the strokes, to feel the world divide itself into the sealed and the shut-out. She stood with her hands wrapped around a cup of the dark continental coffee that lived in her kitchen now, in a tin that refilled itself, and she watched the light go long and gold across the London rooftops, and she waited for the bell, and the bell did not come. The hour of the 7th stroke arrived and passed in ordinary silence. The street lamps came on. Down in the road below, a young couple walked arm in arm through a dusk that no longer belonged to the patrols, laughing at something, unhurried, free. And Hermione watched them and felt her eyes sting with a feeling she could not immediately name because it was one she had not had cause to feel in a very long time. It was the feeling of a thing being over, not lost, not taken, simply, finally, over. The knock came at 8:30. She knew his knock now. She had learned it over 6 weeks of evenings that no longer had to end at a locked door. 6 weeks of dinners at odd tables in odd corners of the city, of long talks that ran past midnight because they could, of the slow, careful work of learning each other in daylight, without a case to justify it or a sealed room to compel it. It had frightened them both at first, the daylight. It was one thing to reach for each other in the dark of a country that gave them nowhere else to go. It was another to choose each other in the morning, with the whole world open and every excuse gone, when staying was no longer forced, but simply wanted. They had circled it warily for the first week, half expecting the thing between them to prove a creature of the dark that would not survive the sun. It had survived. It had done more than survive. She opened the door, and there he was, and the sight of him still did the thing it had begun doing somewhere around the 5th night. The small lift beneath the sternum, the quiet unclenching, the sense of a lit window in a dark house. He had come from the ministry. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the faint grey of a long day worn into his face. But his eyes, when they found hers, had none of the old frost in them, none of the shutters, none of the flat grey armour she had spent 3 years failing to see past. They were open. They had been open for 6 weeks now, and she did not think she would ever get used to it, the simple, astonishing fact of being looked at by Draco Malfoy with nothing hidden behind the looking. "The bell didn't ring," he said. "I know. I waited for it anyway." "So did I." A ghost of a smile, tired and true. "Stood at my window like a fool at 7:30, bracing for it. 2 years of training. The body doesn't forget." She stepped back to let him in, and he came, and the door closed behind him on a London that no longer locked itself against the dark. And for a moment they simply stood in her small, warm flat and looked at each other. 2 people who had learned the whole shape of one another across 9 sealed nights, and were still 6 weeks on, faintly disbelieving that they were permitted to go on doing it. "I brought you something," he said. He held it out. A small parcel, wrapped plainly, the way the coffee tin had first arrived on their shared desk in the days when he had not yet dared to let a kindness carry his name. She took it and unwrapped it, and found inside a key. She looked up at him. "It's to the cottage," he said. "On the moor. I bought it. From the ministry. They were selling off the safe houses now the statute's gone, and I—" He stopped. She watched him gather the courage for it, watched the old instinct to guard himself rise and be, deliberately, set down. "It's where you forgave me. I couldn't bear to think of it going to strangers, and I thought—" His jaw worked. "I thought you might like somewhere that isn't London, somewhere with no bell to wait for. I'm not asking you to. It isn't I only mean that there's a key, and it opens a door, and the door is yours as much as mine, whenever you want it. That's all. That's the whole of it." She closed her hand around the key. It was cold, and then it was warm from her palm, the way everything of his seemed to warm under her touch. "Draco," she said, "you needn't say anything." "You crossed the room again." Her voice had gone unsteady. just now. You bought the place where I forgave you, and you carried the key across London, and you stood in my doorway and you offered it, when every reflex you own was telling you to keep it to yourself where it couldn't be refused. You crossed the room. She lifted the key. You keep doing it. You've been doing it since the 5th night. And I don't think you'll ever quite believe you're the kind of man who crosses the room. So I suppose I'll just have to spend a very long time being the one who tells you that you are. Something moved through his face. That same devastation turned to wonder she had first seen in the vault. The look of a man being handed a thing he had spent his whole life certain he did not deserve. And slowly, against every instinct, beginning to believe he might be allowed to keep. His hand came up and cupped her face, and she turned into it, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. A very long time, he repeated softly. You're proposing to spend a very long time telling me things about myself I won't believe. I'm proposing to spend a very long time, yes. She met his eyes. The rest of it, if you'll have me. That's what I'm proposing. I've thought about it the way I think about everything, which is to say exhaustively and from every angle and at 3 in the morning, and I keep arriving at the same place. I don't want the nights back. I don't want to be locked in a room with you, because the law leaves us nowhere else to go. I want to choose you in the daylight, with all the doors open and every excuse gone, every single day, because there's nowhere I'd rather be than wherever you are. That's the whole of it. That's my whole heart, laid out in rows like evidence. Do with it what you like. He kissed her. He did not weep this time, though his eyes were bright. He had done enough weeping, and this was not grief, but its opposite. The thing that comes after, when the wound has closed and the weight is down, and there is finally room in a person for joy. He kissed her slow and sure and unafraid, one hand in her hair and the other at the small of her back, drawing her into him in the warm light of a flat in a city that no longer feared its own dark. And she wrapped her arms around him and kissed him back with the whole of the heart she had just laid out for him. And the key was still clutched in her fist between them. Warm now, the shape of it pressed into both their palms. Outside, London settled into an ordinary evening. The street lamps burned. Somewhere the young couple from the road below had reached wherever they were going, and lovers all across magical Britain were walking home under a dusk that belonged to them again, and the great enchanted doors of the atrium stood open to a night that no longer needed sealing. The bell hung silent in its tower. It would not ring tonight or any night after. The dark had been given back to the people who lived in it, and they were filling it already with all the small, free, ordinary things that darkness is for. And in a warm flat above a quiet street, 2 people who had found each other in a locked country stood wrapped in one another's arms and did not let go. Not because a law compelled them, not because the doors were sealed and there was nowhere else to be, but because, of all the open doors in all the unlocked world, they had each looked out at everything the lifted dark now offered them and chosen, freely and completely and for good, to stay exactly here. The bell did not ring. It never would again. And neither of them, wrapped in the warm and the light and the ordinary blessed freedom of a night with no curfew in it, found they had the slightest wish to be anywhere the other was not.
So that is the end of their story. Thank you for staying with me until the last night. I want to tell you a little about it. When I was writing this, I kept thinking about one simple thing. It is easy to hate someone for far away. It is easy when you never have to sit in the same room. But when you cannot leave, something changes. You start to see the person, not the enemy, the person. That is why I locked them in. The curve was not really about the love, it was about having nowhere to hide from each other, where is the part I love the most. It is the moment she puts her hand on his arm and the mark. She does not say much, she just does not let go, and he holds her hand there because no one had ever done that before. For me, that small quiet moment says more than any big speech. So, what is the story really about? I think it is this. We all carry a room we cannot leave, a memory, a guilt, a wound, and healing does not come from being right about someone. It comes from being close enough to see them. Hate keeps people apart, but being seen, that is what sets us free. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart, and I will see you in the next story.